Charles Woodward, a 45-year-old man who seemingly had it all, wealth, power, and status, stood in his lavish penthouse on Manhattan's Upper East Side. The sprawling skyline stretched out before him, but the foggy glass windows reflected more than the towering skyscrapers. They mirrored his loneliness, his unshakable feeling that something essential was missing. Despite his immense financial success and the ceaseless hum of New York City's energy, Charles felt empty inside. He whispered to himself, "I have everything a man could want, everything, except the one thing that makes it all matter." He wasn't referring to love, not after 2 failed marriages. For Charles, love was a chaotic gamble, one he no longer cared to play. What he wanted was something tangible, something permanent, an heir to carry on his legacy. He didn't need the volatile promises of romantic love. He needed a child, someone of his own, to secure his name for generations to come. Later that day, Charles navigated the bustling streets of New York in his sleek Lamborghini Diablo. The cacophony of horns and hurried footsteps filled the air as he pulled up to a red light near Central Park. As he waited, a figure appeared outside his car window. A young homeless woman, her face pale, her hair unkempt, and her piercing blue eyes clouded with desperation. She extended a trembling hand and softly asked, "Do you have anything for me?" Irritated, Charles glared at her and snapped, "Get lost." As soon as the light turned green, he sped away, leaving her behind. His mind dismissed the encounter as an inconvenience, but something about the look in her eyes lingered with him. That fleeting moment stirred an unsettling feeling, one he couldn't quite shake. A few blocks later, he abruptly pulled over, muttering under his breath before turning the car around. Charles found her again, standing near the same intersection as before, almost blending into the chaotic backdrop of the city. He pulled up to the curb and rolled down his window. His voice was cold and commanding as he said, "Get in, no questions." The woman hesitated, suspicion etched into her expression. Life on the streets had taught her to be cautious, to trust no one. She shook her head, her voice calm but firm. "I'm not that kind of woman, if that's what you're looking for." Charles raised an eyebrow, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Do you honestly think someone like me would be interested in you for that? You don't even look remotely appealing enough for me to consider such nonsense. You're safe. Now, stop wasting time and get in. I don't have all day. Or would you rather freeze on the streets tonight?" Her blue eyes narrowed as she weighed her options. His bluntness stung, but there was something genuine in his no-nonsense demeanor. After a moment, she nodded and climbed into the passenger seat, moving cautiously. The car's engine purred as it rejoined the chaotic flow of the city. Charles glanced at her from the corner of his eye. She seemed young, likely in her late 20s, but the harshness of her life had aged her. Breaking the silence, Charles spoke with the same detached tone he used in his business deals. "What's your name?" The woman hesitated before replying, her voice steady yet guarded. "Emily." The conversation hung in the air, the tension between them palpable. Though Charles didn't know it yet, this encounter would set into motion a series of events that would change both their lives in ways they couldn't imagine. "I'm going to make you an offer that will change your life," Charles said, his voice calm and calculating, the voice of a man who had mastered the art of negotiation. He leaned back, the dim city lights casting shadows across his face. "I want a child, not a wife, not a relationship, just a child. I'll pay you a fortune and take care of you throughout the pregnancy. All I need is your womb. After that, you're free to go." The woman's blue eyes widened in disbelief as she struggled to process his words. "A child?" she repeated, her voice trembling as if the word carried a weight she wasn't prepared to bear. Charles nodded, his tone matter of fact. "Of course. You have my word. I won't touch you. It will all be done through artificial insemination. What did you think? Anything else would be out of the question." A heavy silence filled the car, the noise of the city outside fading as her thoughts raced. She stared at her hands, torn between outrage and resignation. Her life had crumbled into pieces, a shattered dream in a foreign land. What remained was a hollow shell of hope. Memories of France flooded her mind, the promises she had once clung to, the future she had envisioned. Now, it all seemed so far away. Charles noticed her lips moving softly, her voice murmuring in French, the words laced with sorrow. He understood enough to catch their meaning. "You think I don't understand what you just said?" he interrupted, his cold tone cutting through her reverie. "I'm not just some rich man in a fancy suit. I've seen the world. You said, misery has no end." His eyes narrowed slightly, his voice softening just a fraction. "Is this your way out?" She let out a long, deep sigh, her shoulders slumping, as if the weight of her circumstances had finally crushed her. Slowly, she nodded. The faintest flicker of resolve replaced the despair in her expression. Charles pressed on, his voice unchanging, clinical. "I have 2 questions for you. What's your name, and what are you running from?" She hesitated, her breath catching in her throat before she finally answered. "Antoinette Volée," she said, her French accent curling softly around the words. "I came to the US 5 years ago, chasing a future I thought was waiting for me. When I arrived here, France felt like it had disappeared from my heart. I thought if I sacrificed enough, this country would welcome me with open arms. But this city..." Her voice cracked, her words heavy with grief. "It stripped everything away. My job, my dreams, even the will to remember why I came here in the first place. Now I wander these streets, invisible and without direction." Charles listened in silence, his steely gaze fixed on her. For a moment, something flickered in his expression, a trace of humanity buried deep beneath his composed exterior. She continued, her eyes distant, as if recalling a dream long faded. "What am I running from?" she repeated softly, almost to herself. "Everything, this broken life, the empty promises I made to myself, these streets that whisper my failures with every step I take." Her voice faltered, but she pressed on. "I just want to go home, back to France. Sometimes I dream of its fields, the scent of chestnut trees, the sound of rain on the rooftops of my hometown. But dreams come at a price, and I don't even have enough to buy my way back." A heavy silence hung between them, the air thick with the weight of her words. Antoinette's raw vulnerability pierced through Charles's carefully constructed armor, forcing him to confront a reality he had long ignored. Her pain was a brutal mirror to his own solitude, though hers was etched far more visibly across her worn features. He took a deep breath, regaining his composure. His expression hardened again, returning to the cold, calculated demeanor of the businessman he was. "I understand," he said at last, his voice detached, but laced with a hint of something else, something unspoken. He paused, studying her carefully, as if assessing the possibilities that lay ahead. "I'll ask you just once," Charles said, his voice steady, calm, and precise. "Will you accept my proposal? Will you carry my child and leave afterward? In return, I'll set aside a considerable sum for you, enough to return to France and live comfortably." Antoinette looked at him, her expression a complex mix of resignation and faint relief. Memories of her struggles rushed to the forefront. Every fall, every lost battle, every dashed hope. This offer, as unconventional and cold as it sounded, could be her only way out of the endless cycle of despair. Lowering her head, she closed her eyes briefly. After a soft sigh, she finally replied, her tone gentle but resolute. "Do I even have another choice? I accept." Charles nodded with the efficiency of a man closing a business deal. "We'll draw up a contract with clear terms," he said. "But before that, I'd like to know more about you." "I have one question. Why would someone like me need a loveless womb?" Antoinette asked. Her voice was curious but tinged with disbelief. "You have everything someone of your status would need to make anyone fall for you." Charles Woodward, with his usual composed and calculating demeanor, couldn't ignore the directness of her question. He was unaccustomed to being challenged so openly, especially in moments when he believed he held all the power. His fingers tightened slightly on the steering wheel as the engine of his Lamborghini hummed beneath them. The noise of the bustling city seemed to fade, leaving only the quiet tension between them. His gray eyes locked onto hers, and for a brief moment, his expression flickered, a fleeting trace of vulnerability, frustration, perhaps even nostalgia. But it vanished as quickly as it appeared. Taking a deliberate pause, Charles inhaled deeply, as if bracing himself before launching into a high-stakes negotiation. "My name is Charles Woodward," he began, his tone cold and measured. "And you're right about one thing. I have it all: power, wealth, influence. People either respect me or fear me. But love?" He stopped, letting the word linger in the air before continuing, his voice growing colder. "Love is nothing more than a failed social contract, a string of promises no one ever keeps." His gaze hardened, and his voice became sharper. "I've been there, twice. 2 marriages that both ended in ruins. They never loved me, not for who I am. They loved the image of me, the wealth, the status, the shine of success. That's what they stayed for, not the man behind it all." He tilted his head slightly, a faint bitterness seeping into his voice. "Fall in love with someone of my status? I've done it, and I learned the hard way that love is just another transaction disguised as emotion. I don't need a wife to stay for what I can offer her. I won't bear the weight of empty promises or risk another failed relationship. My only focus is on what matters, my successor." Antoinette listened silently, her expression unreadable as Charles's words hung heavy in the air. Then her blue eyes met his, and for the first time, her voice carried a quiet strength that caught him off guard. "Your words are as calculating as you are," she said softly, her sincerity cutting through his armor. "But I see something beneath all of that, Charles. I see someone who isn't just avoiding love, someone who craves it more than he's willing to admit." Her gaze softened, but her tone remained firm. "Loneliness can disguise itself as strength, but eventually, it always reveals its true face." Charles didn't react. He stared ahead, his face an unreadable mask, and reached for the ignition. The car roared to life, and the silence between them grew heavier as they sped through the city streets. He didn't say a word, letting the hum of the engine fill the void. When they arrived at his mansion on the Upper East Side, a towering structure of marble and steel, Charles pulled into the underground garage. The grand estate exuded wealth and power, yet it felt cold and lifeless, an imposing fortress that mirrored the man who owned it. Charles stepped out without a word, leaving Antoinette to take in the overwhelming sight. Antoinette stared at the massive building, her awe mixed with unease. It had been years since she'd been anywhere close to this kind of luxury. As she stepped out of the car, it felt as though she was crossing an invisible threshold, leaving behind the streets she'd known for a world that seemed completely foreign, yet no less isolating. Charles stepped out of the car, and as Antoinette followed, he paused for a moment. His eyes swept over her worn clothes and fragile demeanor, the contrast between his spotless Lamborghini and the weathered woman striking even to him. Without much thought, he gestured with a hand as if solving a logistical problem. "Come inside," he said simply. Breaking the silence, he led her into the grand mansion. The gleaming white marble walls, the sweeping staircase, and the artwork that graced the halls, pieces by artists she had only seen in books, were all overwhelming. It wasn't a home, it was a museum, cold and detached, devoid of warmth or life. Charles guided her to a vast living area, decorated with minimalist elegance, a space that exuded wealth but no comfort. A middle-aged woman appeared almost instantly upon their arrival, her presence efficient and composed. Charles gave a curt command. "Stephanie, make her presentable. Clothes, a bath, food, whatever she needs. And keep this between us. The rest of the staff doesn't need to know." His words were cold and clinical, as though he were discussing logistics for a business transaction. Stephanie, however, offered a warm, reassuring smile that stood in sharp contrast to Charles's detached demeanor. She turned to Antoinette, her tone kind. "Come on, let's get you settled." Antoinette followed Stephanie down a long hallway, glancing at her surroundings with quiet astonishment. The luxury and scale of the mansion were unlike anything she had experienced in years. Yet, beneath the awe, she knew this was just the beginning of an arrangement that would change her life forever. A couple of hours later, Charles sat in his office, a grand room lined with shelves of leather-bound books and large windows that offered a sweeping view of Manhattan's skyline. Seated behind a dark, polished wooden desk, he focused on the documents spread before him. His trusted lawyer, Tom Francis, sat across from him, meticulously reviewing the details of the contract. The quiet of the room was interrupted by a knock at the door. Without looking up, Charles said, "Come in." The door opened to reveal his housekeeper, Elizabeth. Always composed and efficient, she clasped her hands in front of her. "Mr. Woodward, you called for me?" she asked. Charles glanced up briefly. "Yes, Elizabeth. Bring the young woman down immediately." "Of course, sir," Elizabeth replied before exiting the room with the same calm precision she had entered. The office fell silent again, the air thick with a palpable tension, as if both men were waiting for an unspoken storm to arrive. Minutes passed, and another soft knock broke the stillness. "Come in," Charles said, his tone flat. The door creaked open, and what followed left both men momentarily speechless. Standing in the doorway was Antoinette, utterly transformed. Gone was the disheveled and fragile figure they had first encountered. Now, she radiated a quiet, almost ethereal beauty. Her hair, now clean and shining, fell in soft waves, catching the light like threads of gold. Her once dull blue eyes sparkled with clarity, as if a storm had finally passed. Her posture was poised and elegant, her movements graceful yet understated. She wore a simple, sophisticated outfit that highlighted her slender frame without pretension. Tom Francis froze, his gaze fixed on her, seemingly spellbound. Finally, he managed to stammer, "Miss, you look absolutely stunning." Antoinette, who had been looking down, lifted her eyes at his words. A soft blush crept across her cheeks, but she quickly composed herself, her expression steady once more. Charles, however, felt something unfamiliar stir within him, a sharp, unwelcome pang in his chest. It was jealousy, dark and insistent, creeping into his thoughts. The realization unsettled him, though he would never admit it. Shoving the feeling aside, he masked his discomfort with sharpness. "All right," he said brusquely, his tone colder than usual, slicing through the moment. "Let's proceed with reviewing the contract terms." His words, clinical and direct, filled the room as he spread the document across the desk. The brief spell of the moment was broken, but the undercurrents of something deeper lingered, unspoken, yet undeniable. Antoinette stepped forward, her heels clicking softly against the polished floor. The air in the room felt heavy with tension, each movement between them formal, yet laced with unspoken emotions. When the contract was finally signed, its terms bound them to an arrangement that would irrevocably alter the course of their lives. The next morning, Charles woke early as usual, but his mind was unusually restless. Manhattan's dawn painted the sky in soft hues of pink and gold, the sunlight spilling through the towering windows of his mansion. While the city below began to stir, Charles's thoughts were elsewhere. The details of the contract lingered in his mind as he made his way to the wing of the house where Antoinette slept, his footsteps echoing through the quiet halls. What Charles couldn't yet understand was that no matter how carefully we try to structure our desires on paper, the human heart remains unpredictable, defying any attempt to control it. He knocked softly on her door before opening it decisively, his expression cold and unwavering as always. "We're leaving immediately," he announced, his tone brooking no argument. Antoinette, still groggy, blinked at him in confusion. The weight of sleep and his abruptness slowed her response. "Where are we going?" she asked, her voice laced with fatigue as she began to rise from the bed. The sunlight flooding the room softened the edges of Charles's sharp demeanor, though his answer remained curt. "To fulfill the first clause of the contract," he replied, turning and leaving her little choice but to follow. Minutes later, they were in Charles's Lamborghini Diablo, the engine roaring as fiercely as the city coming alive around them. Charles drove in silence, his face as unreadable as always. Inside the car, however, the air was thick with unspoken thoughts. Antoinette stared out the window, her gaze following the blurred skyline as buildings streaked past like fleeting shadows of her fractured past. Her mind swirled with deep, unspoken reflections. Sometimes, the quiet between two people can feel louder than the most heated conversation. Eventually, the car pulled up in front of one of the city's most prestigious fertility clinics. The building, sleek and immaculate, bore the understated but unmistakable signs of exclusivity, recognizable only to the city's elite. A polished silver plaque gleamed outside, its minimalism a quiet display of wealth and perfection. As Antoinette stepped out of the car, her eyes lifted toward the imposing structure before her. For a brief moment, she hesitated, a thought crossing her mind, one that stretched far beyond the terms of their carefully crafted contract. They were bound together now, tied to a purpose far more significant than either of them could fully grasp. Bringing a life into the world is never a hollow act, no matter how it begins. Antoinette thought quietly, while this life grows within me, it will be loved. This isn't just a deal, it's the start of something far deeper, something no contract or circumstance can take away. Charles walked beside her, his demeanor ever cold, indifferent to the emotions swirling within her. Together, they stepped through the automatic doors of the clinic. The pristine white walls and the sterile air seemed designed to erase doubt and hesitation, as if the luxury and clinical precision of the space could simplify the complexity of what they were about to undertake. Yet, within Antoinette's heart, questions and emotions lingered, unanswered, unresolved. The heaviest steps are often those taken in resignation, and though her feet moved forward, her soul remained searching. Silence, for now, was her refuge, even if her heart yearned to speak. They were promptly greeted by a team of medical professionals, each polished and precise in their demeanor. Every explanation of the process was delivered with clinical detachment, as though they were merely following a protocol, unconnected to the humanity of the moment. Antoinette nodded along silently, offering no response. Acceptance, she realized, can feel like surrender, but sometimes it's the only path forward. The process was set to be efficient, though not immediate. Consultations, tests, and reviews were scheduled with meticulous care to ensure everything proceeded flawlessly. As the days passed and their visits to the clinic became routine, the weight of their arrangement grew heavier. It hung between them, unseen but undeniable, like a shadow cast by the promises they had made, not just to each other, but to themselves. Antoinette understood, even if she didn't say it aloud, that this agreement with Charles was more than a legal contract. It carried an emotional responsibility that no document could ever capture. Life often demands things of us that can't be written into clauses or terms. Sometimes, the most profound obligations are those we choose to bear, unspoken and unasked. Finally, the day of the insemination arrived. As expected, the process was clinical and detached, meticulously orchestrated to align with Charles's calculated approach to life. The sterile environment of the room only emphasized the transactional nature of their arrangement. Yet, for Antoinette, the coldness of the room couldn't extinguish the warmth beginning to bloom inside her. While the medical team moved with precision, her thoughts wandered. To her, this wasn't just a procedure, it was sacred. Lying beneath the bright, sterile lights, she stared at the plain white ceiling and allowed her mind to drift to the future. A lump formed in her throat, and she closed her eyes as something deep within her stirred, a whisper of truth she could no longer ignore. This isn't just a contract. This is a life I will love with all my heart, even if it was born from this agreement. Her hand instinctively rested on her abdomen, a gesture of quiet protection. In that moment, she sensed the profound change taking root within her. The love she began to feel wasn't a product of any agreement. It was born of the bond already forming between her and the life that would soon grow inside her. On the drive home, the silence in the car was thick and heavy, pressing down like a fog. Antoinette stared out the window, watching the city blur past in streaks of light and shadow. Her mind was racing, her thoughts an unsteady mix of fear, hope, and quiet determination. Finally, Charles broke the silence. His tone detached as ever. This was just the first step. Now we wait, he said, the words carrying the same finality as the close of a business transaction rather than the beginning of something monumental. Antoinette glanced at him uneasily, her stomach twisting at the cold pragmatism in his voice. To Charles, it seemed as though the day's events were nothing more than another task, completed on his meticulously organized agenda. She took a deep breath, knowing she had to speak. Her voice, steady yet tinged with emotion, broke the heavy silence. "Children aren't just the result of desire or careful planning," she said, her words deliberate and heartfelt. "They're reflections of our souls, the legacy we leave behind when we're no longer here to tell our story. Today, we've done more than fulfill a clause. We've lit a flame, one that no contract could ever extinguish, a flame born of life, not wealth or agreements." Charles, who had maintained his cold and impenetrable demeanor, found himself shaken. Her words pierced through his carefully constructed walls, leaving a mark he couldn't ignore. A chill ran down his spine, a strange and unfamiliar sensation for a man who had long buried his emotions under layers of logic and control. For the first time, he truly saw Antoinette, not just as part of an arrangement, but as a woman capable of stirring something deep within his guarded heart. Unable to brush off the weight of her words, he pulled the car to a stop on a quiet, deserted street. Turning toward her, his expression was unreadable, but his gaze lingered on her as if he were seeing her for the first time. His usually distant eyes held something different, an emotion he couldn't quite name. "What do you know about the soul?" he asked softly, his voice barely above a whisper. It carried a vulnerability he had never allowed himself to show. Antoinette met his gaze, unwavering and calm. Her voice carried the wisdom of someone who had lived through hardship and come to understand life's intangible truths. "The soul isn't for sale, Charles," she said gently. "No amount of money or contracts can own it. Love, whether you accept it or not, will always find its way into what you create." Her words struck something deep within him, echoing in ways he couldn't ignore. A forgotten feeling stirred in his chest, sending chills up his spine. For the first time in years, Charles Woodward had no response. The man who had always controlled every aspect of his life, who saw the world through the lens of transactions and negotiations, now found himself silent, confronted with a truth he couldn't rationalize or bargain away. Since the procedure, their interactions had been minimal, limited to the bare essentials. Both had kept their distance, yet both were acutely aware that something far greater was beginning to unfold between them, something unspoken, like a river quietly carving its path toward an unseen destination. Life had started to take shape, though neither of them could predict where it would lead. Destiny, after all, moves like a current through us, its direction always shrouded in mystery. As they prepared for their next visit to the fertility clinic, the air in the car felt heavier than before. Both seemed to sense that whatever words were spoken, there would alter the course of their lives irrevocably. Charles drove in his usual silence, his face unreadable, though inside, anticipation swirled with an unnameable emotion he couldn't place. Antoinette stared out the window, her expression outwardly calm, though inside she was battling a storm of emotions. She didn't know what lay ahead, but her heart felt the weight of the unknown. The answers of the soul are rarely spoken aloud. They live in the silences that surround us, in the spaces where words fail. At the clinic, they were greeted by a team of medical professionals, their demeanor polished and professional. The sterile environment reinforced the gravity of their purpose. As they walked through the pristine hallways, a sign on the wall caught Antoinette's eye. Its words read, "Creation is always a divine act, a whispered breath of the universe." The message lingered in her thoughts, a quiet reminder of the profound journey they had only just begun. The gynecologist, a composed middle-aged man, greeted them with a polite smile. "Good morning, Mr. and Mrs. Woodward," he said as he led them into a private room. "Today, we'll find out if the procedure was successful." As they walked toward the examination room, Antoinette's heart raced. She knew this moment would change her life forever. This wasn't just a medical appointment. It felt like a bridge between the mundane and the profound. Without understanding why, Charles reached out and gently took her hand. The gesture was uncharacteristic, his touch soft, and for the briefest moment, it seemed as though his detached demeanor had cracked. Antoinette broke the silence with a quiet observation, her words laced with the kind of wisdom that often left Charles speechless. "The heart, when it senses the existence of new life, can't help but beat faster," she said. "It recognizes its own echo in every beginning." The doctor motioned for her to take a seat on the examination table. Please, Mrs. Vaugh, he said, gesturing politely. Charles stood near the door, his usual stoic expression firmly in place. Yet his eyes that were so accustomed to scanning financial reports and spreadsheets, were now fixed on the screen, drawn to the possibility of something far more meaningful than numbers. Antoinette lay back on the table, her body tense with anticipation. The gynecologist prepared the ultrasound machine as a deep silence filled the room, each passing moment heavy with expectation. Charles's eyes remained locked on the monitor, waiting for the result of what had once been nothing more than a written agreement. But even he couldn't deny that it had evolved into something much greater. Paper seals deals, he thought, but it's the heart that makes them real. The cold gel touched Antoinette's stomach, and the room seemed to grow even quieter. Then, the sound of a heartbeat filled the air, a steady, rhythmic pulse. Everyone froze. The gynecologist studied the monitor, a soft smile spreading across his face before he turned to them. Life doesn't announce itself with fanfare, he said, his voice calm and measured, but with the eternal rhythm of a beating heart. He paused for a moment, letting the sound fill the room. Here it is, he said, pointing to the screen. The image showed the unmistakable signs of life growing within her. But then his expression grew more serious. There's something else you should know, the doctor said, his tone steady but significant. Charles, who had been standing rigidly near the door, leaned forward, his curiosity evident for the first time. What is it, doctor? He asked, his voice noticeably softer than usual. The gynecologist glanced at the monitor and then back at them, offering a kind smile. There's not just one heartbeat, he said. There are 3. Congratulations, you're expecting triplets. Time seemed to stop. 3 heartbeats, 3 lives. Antoinette felt a wave of emotion rush over her, a chill running down her spine as tears welled in her eyes. The joy was overwhelming, almost incomprehensible. Inside her, 3 tiny hearts beat in perfect harmony. Charles, too, was overwhelmed. For a moment, the carefully guarded walls he had built around himself faltered. In an uncharacteristic gesture, he leaned over and pressed a soft kiss to Antoinette's forehead. She instinctively placed her hands on her belly, her mind racing with thoughts of the new lives growing inside her. Love isn't measured by contracts or agreements, she thought. It multiplies, overflows, and takes forms even destiny cannot predict. Charles stepped back, his gaze lingering on Antoinette as she lay on the table. He saw her differently now, not just as the woman carrying his heirs, but as someone who had unknowingly begun to thaw the coldness within him. For the first time in years, Charles Woodward felt something he couldn't calculate, control, or quantify: hope. She was no longer just a woman in his life. She was someone inexplicably sharing the greatest miracle of existence with him. For Charles, a man unaccustomed to caring for others, something shifted within him that afternoon. 3 months after the insemination, he found himself standing in the doorway of the living room, watching Antoinette as she sat on the terrace. The soft glow of the setting sun bathed her in a golden light, illuminating her figure as she gazed out at the horizon. Her expression was peaceful, almost as if her heart had found a rare moment of calm amidst a noisy, chaotic world. Now showing the early signs of pregnancy, Antoinette brought a hand to her temple and closed her eyes briefly, a faint shadow of fatigue crossing her face. Charles frowned, concern flickering across his usually stoic features. He wasn't used to seeing her like this, vulnerable. Despite the cold, calculated arrangement they had made, she had always appeared strong, almost unshakable. But now, something instinctive stirred within him, compelling him to act. He walked toward the terrace with steady, purposeful steps. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice softer than usual, though it still carried the characteristic restraint he was known for. Antoinette slowly opened her eyes and met his gaze, her expression a mix of surprise and calm. "Just a little dizzy," she replied with a faint smile, as though trying to downplay her discomfort. "I suppose it's normal." Charles hesitated, unsure of what to do. Normally, he would have called Stephanie or another member of the staff, delegating the situation like any other logistical matter. But this time, something inside him urged him to respond differently. Without overthinking it, he leaned down and, with a surprising gentleness that felt foreign even to him, lifted her into his arms. As he carried her, Charles became acutely aware of not just her light frame, but also the invisible weight of his own transformation. Startled, Antoinette looked up at him with wide eyes. "You don't have to, Charles. I can walk," she said, her tone a mix of humility and bewilderment. Yet there was no trace of protest in her voice. "No," he replied firmly, though there was an unfamiliar softness to his tone. "Let me." The walk from the terrace to her room was silent, but it wasn't an awkward silence. For Charles, it felt as though he could sense the rhythm of life with every step he took. Holding her close was a poignant reminder of how much his world was changing. Sometimes, the most profound emotions are expressed in moments of stillness. When they reached her bedroom door, he used his foot to nudge it open and stepped inside. Antoinette tensed slightly in his arms, her serene expression shifting to one of surprise and amazement as her gaze swept across the room. It had been completely transformed. Every corner now spoke of the new lives they were preparing to welcome. Fresh flowers filled the air with their gentle scent. A giant stuffed animal perched on the dresser added a touch of warmth, and soft, inviting decor turned the room into a sanctuary. It wasn't just a room anymore. It was a space that celebrated motherhood and the three little lives growing within her. "What is this?" Antoinette whispered, her voice barely audible as her eyes scanned every detail. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and wonder. Charles, his usual calm demeanor faltering slightly, allowed a flicker of vulnerability to cross his face. "I wanted you to feel more comfortable," he said gently. "I thought you might like it." His tone was slow, almost hesitant, as though he were second-guessing his decision. "I wasn't expecting this," she murmured, overwhelmed by the thoughtfulness of the gesture. As he carefully helped her recline onto the bed, Charles sat on its edge, watching her quietly as she took in the room's transformation. The silence between them deepened, but it was no longer empty. It carried an unspoken depth, a connection that didn't need words. Finally, Charles broke the silence. "I thought, every new life deserves a space filled with light," he said, surprising even himself with the tenderness in his voice, "a place where love can find its home." Antoinette turned to look at him, her gaze so intense it sent a shiver down his spine. She spoke softly, her words carrying a weight that seemed to echo in the room. "Love asks for nothing in return, but it changes everything," she said. "Even the hardest soul eventually lets itself be reshaped by it." Charles looked away, breaking eye contact for a moment, unable to bear the raw emotion in her words. Something deep within him, long buried and carefully sealed away, began to crack. The quiet between them grew deeper, but this time it felt shared, pulling them closer in a way neither had anticipated. For the first time, Charles allowed himself to feel something, just a sliver of warmth. The love he had kept at bay for so long was beginning to seep through the cracks in his armor. His hand remained intertwined with Antoinette's as the soft afternoon breeze drifted through the open windows. In that stillness, both realized they were embarking on a journey far deeper than they had ever imagined. Charles awoke early that morning, the weight of the day pressing heavily on his chest. Over the past few weeks, his connection with Antoinette had evolved into something far more profound than the agreement that had brought them together. Without fully realizing it, he had begun to care for her deeply. But today felt different. Today would change everything. Despite the mansion's grandeur, the halls were unusually quiet, cloaked in a stillness that seemed to suspend time. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath while the three lives growing within Antoinette prepared for their grand arrival. Charles paced down the long hallway, his thoughts swirling with anticipation and nerves. As he reached for the doorknob to her room, a faint voice stopped him. "Charles, I think it's time," she whispered, her tone trembling with both excitement and nerves. He turned to see her standing in the doorway, her face radiant despite her exhaustion, illuminated by an inner glow that took his breath away. For a moment, his heart skipped a beat. Without hesitation, he moved to her side, helping her gently to her feet and preparing to take her to the hospital for the moment that would forever change their lives. The Lamborghini Diablo's engine roared to life, but it was nothing compared to the frantic pounding of their hearts. Antoinette rested one hand on her rounded belly, her other hand clutching the door handle for balance. She glanced sideways at Charles, studying his profile. Over the past months, she had watched him change in ways she hadn't thought possible. What had started as a purely transactional relationship now felt like something deeper, something unspoken, but undeniable. "I'll be right here with you," Charles said softly, his voice steady yet filled with a resolve she hadn't heard before. It carried a promise, one that felt as immovable as the man himself. "Thank you, Charles," Antoinette murmured, her tone filled with gratitude and raw emotion. The drive to the hospital passed in a blur. When they arrived, a team of medical professionals was already waiting. Antoinette was whisked away to the delivery room with Charles close behind, never letting go of her hand. The hours stretched endlessly as Antoinette labored. Each contraction seemed to reverberate not just through her body, but through Charles's very soul. He stayed by her side, holding her hand tightly, offering encouragement in a voice softer and more tender than she'd ever heard from him. "Breathe, Antoinette. You're doing amazing," he whispered, his eyes fixed on her face as she pushed through the pain. The sheer strength she displayed in those moments left him in awe. Minutes bled into hours, and finally, the first cry pierced the air. A boy. Their son. Charles felt his throat tighten, an indescribable mix of emotions swelling within him. Something inside him broke and rebuilt itself all at once. Moments later, a second cry echoed through the room. Another boy. Then, after a final, heart-stopping moment, the third cry arrived. A girl. 3 tiny lives, 3 hearts beating in harmony. Charles stood frozen, his entire world tilting. Every meticulously laid plan, every carefully crafted ambition suddenly seemed trivial. He couldn't take his eyes off the 3 fragile, perfect beings who had just entered the world. "They're perfect," Antoinette whispered, her voice weak but filled with awe. Exhausted but glowing, she gazed down at her newborns, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her trembling hands reached out to caress their tiny faces. The overwhelming love she felt was more powerful than anything she had ever imagined. It consumed her completely. Charles, equally moved, held tightly to her hand, his gaze locked on the little bodies now cradled by the nurses. For the first time in his life, he felt a connection to something far greater than himself. He couldn't buy it, control it, or predict it. It was life in its purest, rawest form. But as Charles took in the overwhelming joy of the moment, his attention was drawn to Antoinette. Her tears, though partially filled with happiness, carried an undeniable weight of sorrow. He could sense her pain, a feeling he was just beginning to understand. Her tears weren't just for the beauty of the present, they were for the future, a future dictated by the unyielding terms of their agreement. Soon, she would have to leave these tiny beings she already loved more than anything in the world. She would have to hand them over to a life she couldn't be part of. "Charles," Antoinette sobbed, her voice trembling. "I don't want to leave them, but this was our deal, and I'll honor it, even if it tears me apart." Each word she spoke felt like a dagger to Charles's heart. The joy he had felt moments earlier was now mingled with the cold, harsh reality of their arrangement. The rigid terms of their contract, once so clear and logical, now seemed utterly meaningless in the face of Antoinette's tears. Without speaking, Charles leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead, a gesture of comfort and an unspoken apology. A lump rose in his throat, a pressure in his chest that he had never experienced before. Something inside him had shifted forever. Like Antoinette, he couldn't ignore what truly mattered anymore. Antoinette gently touched her daughter's face, tears streaming down her cheeks. She couldn't stop them, and neither could Charles. Everything had changed in ways neither of them had anticipated. In that moment, Antoinette realized that love, unexpected, unplanned, could surpass any contract or agreement ever written. She didn't know how she would face what lay ahead, but for now, she held tightly to the fleeting moment with the children she had brought into the world, who soon wouldn't be hers to hold. Charles stood frozen, silently watching her. Her pain was palpable, and for the first time, he felt utterly powerless. He couldn't let this end like this. Something had to change, but he didn't yet know how. The morning after the delivery, the soft light of dawn filtered through the hospital room's windows, casting a gentle glow across the space. Antoinette rested peacefully after the long, grueling night. Her expression, though tired, carried a quiet satisfaction from having brought 3 lives into the world. Charles, usually distant, had spent the night in a chair beside her bed. Though he didn't admit it aloud, the vulnerability and exhaustion etched on Antoinette's face deeply moved him. She had given everything of herself, and in her stillness, he saw her strength. As the sun rose higher, Charles quietly left the room, careful not to wake her. He needed a moment to gather himself and planned to grab breakfast before returning with something to make her more comfortable. His footsteps echoed purposefully down the hospital hallway. When he returned, he paused outside Antoinette's door, startled by what he saw. The door was slightly ajar, and through the opening, he noticed that the room had been transformed. Dozens of vibrant bouquets filled the space, their colors bright and cheerful. But what stopped him cold was the sight of Tom Francis, his trusted lawyer, sitting in the chair where Charles had spent the night. A strange feeling churned inside Charles as he froze in the doorway, observing the scene. Tom leaned toward Antoinette, speaking in a low voice. His words drifted to Charles, each one hitting like a blow. "Antoinette, I know everything has happened so quickly, and what I'm about to say might surprise you." Tom began gently, his tone unusually soft. "But I can't let this moment slip away." Charles's breath caught as he watched Tom take Antoinette's hand delicately, as if handling something fragile. "Since I met you, something in me has changed," Tom continued, sincerity evident in every word. "You're extraordinary. I've never met anyone like you." Antoinette, still weak from childbirth, looked at Tom with a mix of astonishment and confusion. She clearly hadn't been prepared for such a confession. "Tom," she whispered, her voice barely audible, searching for the right words, but finding none. Charles stood frozen, the sharp pang in his chest intensifying as he watched. The flowers, Tom's words, the intimate gesture, it was too much. For a man who had always prided himself on control, Charles now found himself adrift in unfamiliar territory. For the first time, he was forced to confront emotions he had long buried, and he couldn't look away. Tom's tone, the way he held Antoinette's hand, it all became painfully clear. Charles realized, with growing discomfort, that his lawyer and supposed friend wasn't there for legal matters or out of courtesy. Tom was deeply in love with her. Still holding her hand, Tom continued, "Antoinette, I don't want this to be just a fleeting moment in your life. I want to give you more. I want you to have a home, a life, without pressure, without clauses, without contracts. Just us." He took a deep breath, his gaze unwavering as he reached into his pocket and revealed a stunning ring. "Antoinette, will you marry me?" he asked, his voice steady but filled with emotion. At that precise moment, Charles could no longer contain himself. He pushed the door open and stepped into the room. The sound startled both of them. Tom released Antoinette's hand and turned to face him, his expression calm and composed, as though nothing out of the ordinary had just occurred. "Charles," Tom greeted him with a polite smile, as if this were just another meeting. "I wasn't expecting you back so soon." Charles walked slowly toward the bed, his expression controlled, but his eyes betrayed the storm of emotions roiling within him. He glanced at Antoinette, who looked as shocked as he was by what had just transpired. Her gaze shifted nervously toward the vibrant bouquets of flowers that now filled the room, flowers that hadn't been there when he left. "Tom," Charles said coldly, his tone sharp enough to cut through the tension. "The flowers, they're yours, aren't they?" Tom nodded without hesitation, his calm demeanor unwavering. "They are. She deserves to be surrounded by beauty, don't you agree?" Though the words were mild, they carried an edge, a subtle challenge. Charles's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. The silence in the room was palpable as Charles wrestled with emotions he wasn't accustomed to: jealousy, confusion, vulnerability. He'd built his life on control and precision, but now it was unraveling before his eyes. "I see you've offered her something else as well," Charles finally said, his voice laced with icy sarcasm. Marriage. Here, in the hospital, just after she's given birth. Tom rose from his chair with deliberate calm. Yes, Charles, I've offered her something real. Something that isn't bound by contracts and agreements. I believe that's what she needs. Someone who sees her for who she is, not as part of an arrangement. Charles's fists clenched at his sides, his composure hanging by a thread. He had never felt so exposed, so out of control. For months, he had convinced himself that everything was perfectly calculated, that he alone was the architect of Antoinette's and their children's futures. Now, he realized how far from the truth that was. Tom's presence was undeniable, and his intentions extended far beyond legalities. This isn't the right time, Charles said firmly, his voice low and steady, though his frustration simmered beneath the surface. She's just given birth. She needs rest, not more pressure. Tom met Charles's gaze, his expression a mixture of defiance and calm. You're right, Charles. This isn't the time for pressure, but it's also not the time to pretend feelings don't exist. What I feel for her won't just disappear because you want everything to remain a business arrangement. Antoinette, who had remained silent throughout the exchange, finally spoke, her voice weary and strained. Tom, Charles, she whispered, raising a hand to her forehead. Please, not now. I just want to rest. Both men stepped back, the tension between them still thick, but now tempered by Antoinette's clear exhaustion. Tom cast one last glance at her before heading for the door. Rest, Antoinette, he said softly. I'll be here if you need me. When the door closed, Charles remained by the bed, unsure of what to say. The silence between him and Antoinette was heavy, but it carried an unspoken truth neither was ready to confront. Slowly, Charles sat down in the chair Tom had vacated. He watched as Antoinette closed her eyes, overwhelmed by everything that had transpired. As he sat there, one thought became increasingly clear. This wasn't just a contract anymore, and that realization terrified him. 3 months passed since Antoinette had given birth to the triplets. 3 months filled with overwhelming love for her children, but also a deep, aching sadness. The terms of their agreement loomed over her like a shadow. The day had finally arrived, the day she was to leave the mansion, leave her children, and walk away from the life she had come to know. In her room, surrounded by belongings that reminded her of her children, Antoinette quietly packed her things. A single suitcase, nearly empty, held only the bare essentials. The rest, her love, her memories, couldn't be packed away or taken with her. As she folded the last item, tears streamed down her face. The pain of leaving her children was almost unbearable, but she knew she had no choice. The agreement she had signed so long ago demanded it. The essentials she packed into the suitcase felt meaningless now. The wealth Charles had promised her no longer held any value. Antoinette didn't want the money. She wanted her children. As she closed the nearly empty suitcase, the pain in her chest grew unbearable. Tears streamed down her face as she picked up each of her babies, holding them close one by one and kissing their tiny faces, knowing this might be the last time she'd ever see them. The triplets, unaware of their mother's heartbreak, slept peacefully in their cribs. Antoinette stood over them, committing every detail of their angelic faces, their tiny fingers, and their soft breaths to memory. She had signed the contract believing it would secure a future, but she never imagined the cost would be her soul. Through her sobs, a thought pierced her mind. I should have stayed a wanderer. Her freedom might have spared her this agony. But then she looked at them, these perfect little beings, and she knew she couldn't regret their existence. She loved her children with everything she had, and though she hated to admit it, she loved Charles too. Descending the mansion's grand staircase, Antoinette's steps were heavy and deliberate, her small suitcase dragging behind her. Each step felt like a dagger to her heart. The sound of her heels echoed through the vast, empty hall, amplifying the coldness of what was once a sanctuary, but now felt like a prison of pain. Reaching the massive front door, she rested her trembling hand on the doorknob, her breath catching in her throat. This was really the end. Drawing in a deep breath, she steeled herself. The airport awaited, and with it, a return to a country that no longer felt like home. Determined to honor the contract she had signed, she began to turn the doorknob when a deep, familiar voice echoed through the silence. "Antoinette, where are you going?" She froze but didn't turn around. Charles's voice, firm and unwavering, seemed to carry the weight of the mansion itself. "Is it Tom Francis?" he pressed, stepping closer. "Is it because you've fallen for him?" Her hand fell from the door, and she shut her eyes tightly. Her emotions swirled in a storm of pain and anger. She took a moment to gather herself before slowly turning to face him, her tear-streaked face meeting his intense gaze. "You don't understand anything," she said, her voice trembling with frustration and despair. "This isn't about Tom. Remember the last clause of the contract? I have to leave the mansion, leave the country, 90 days after giving birth. That's what we agreed on, Charles." Charles stopped a few feet away from her, his breathing heavy. But in his eyes, there was more than frustration. There was fear, a fear he couldn't hide, fear of losing her. Without a word, Charles reached into his pocket and pulled out the contract, the document that had defined their relationship from the beginning. Holding it firmly in front of her, he didn't read it, didn't argue over it. Instead, he did something completely unexpected. With a sudden surge of emotion, Charles began tearing the contract to shreds. Piece by piece, he ripped it apart, letting the fragments fall to the floor. Antoinette stared at him, stunned. "I'm sorry, Antoinette," Charles said, his voice breaking as he dropped to his knees before her. "Do you know what you've taught me? Remember when I told you I couldn't love anyone again because of my past, because I'd been hurt by two women who only cared about money? You've shown me something different. Without even trying, you've changed everything for me." His voice cracked as he continued, his vulnerability on full display. "It's madness to hate all roses because one thorn pricked you," he said, echoing words that had once been buried in his mind. "I don't want you to go. I don't care about the contract or the deal we made. The only thing I care about is you, staying here with our children, with me." His voice softened, his words laced with desperation. "I'm not asking you to love me. I'm not asking you to change how you feel. Even if you love Tom or someone else, I don't care. Just stay. Stay for them. Stay for the triplets." The anguish on Antoinette's face began to ease as she absorbed his words. Charles, a man who had always been the epitome of strength and control, was now on his knees before her, raw and exposed. She watched him for what felt like an eternity, her heart caught between the pain of their past and the hope of what could be. Finally, with a tenderness that reflected her inner conflict, she raised her hand and gently placed it on his head. "Amara, Tom Sawyer," she said with a faint, bittersweet laugh, her tears now mingling with something new, something warm, something that felt like forgiveness. "Charles, how can you be so foolish?" Antoinette's voice trembled as her fingers softly brushed through his hair. "It's you I've loved since the very first day I saw you." Charles looked up, disbelief flashing in his eyes at her words. For a moment, he could hardly process what she was saying. Antoinette smiled through her tears, her emotions spilling over as she continued. "It was always you. From the moment you saved me on that street, from the instant our paths crossed in such a strange way, even when I didn't want to admit it, even when you hid me behind the terms of a contract, my heart was always yours." Still kneeling, Charles felt his entire world shift around her words. What had begun as a cold, calculated agreement had grown into something so profound he could never have imagined it. "Antoinette," he whispered, his voice unsteady as he took her hand in his. "I love you too. I've loved you all along, even when I tried to deny it. Please, stay. Not for the children, not because of the contract, but for us. I want us to be a family. I want to share our lives together." He paused, his voice breaking with emotion. "It would be the greatest honor of my life if you would be my wife and my one true love." Antoinette looked at him, her tear-filled eyes shining with both surprise and joy. Without hesitation, she dropped the suitcase she had been clutching and threw her arms around him, holding him tightly. "I love you, Charles," she whispered through her sobs, her words carrying all the feelings she had held back for so long. Charles held her close, his arms wrapped around her as though he never wanted to let her go. As he cradled her in his embrace, he leaned in and kissed her, a deep, passionate kiss that carried the weight of everything they had left unspoken for so many months. In that moment, their love finally broke free, unshackled by contracts, doubts, or fears. Months later, the mansion, once cold and lifeless, was brimming with warmth, joy, and laughter. Charles and Antoinette's wedding was an intimate celebration, filled with love and the happiness of those closest to them. In their arms were the triplets, each one a living testament to the journey that had brought them here. What had started as a business arrangement had blossomed into something extraordinary, a family. Charles, a man who had spent his life searching for something greater than himself, had finally found it. As he gazed at his wife and children, he realized that what he had signed all those months ago was no mere contract. It was the start of a lifelong pact with love. If this story touched your heart, show your support by leaving a like and subscribing to our channel. Share your thoughts and personal stories with us in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Every word you contribute builds a stronger, more connected community, creating a warm and welcoming space for everyone to share and connect. And don't forget, there are more incredible stories coming your way soon. We're always here to bring you meaningful, entertaining tales filled with deep values. See you next time.